Good evening. I'm happy to be here with all of you. Certainly, excuse me, I'm battling a little bit of a cold, so if I do that occasionally, I hope you'll forgive me. I'm honored to be here, particularly with such distinguished panelists, Doug and Jonathan. I'd like to express my thanks to NCCM for hosting tonight's event, particularly Ihsan and Miriam for all the work that they've done. They have received incessant emails from me over the course of the past few weeks and have always been quite gracious in replying, and so I'm thankful for that. This is my second time in Toronto. The first time I was here in 2009, and we were talking at dinner. I believe the place that I visited with my family was an area called Kensington Market. There we go, Kensington Market. You can tell I'm new. And it was a wonderful experience. The only thing that I do really remember, though, was that I was accosted there by a drunk man who proceeded to ask me to buy him Chinese medicinal herbs. That hasn't happened this time, but the night is young. So, back in 2009, there was a film that came out. It was called The Single Man, and it starred Colin Firth, the actor Colin Firth. Maybe some of you saw the film. Really wonderful film. Colin Firth played an English professor named George Falconer, and Professor Falconer is talking to his, I guess it was a high school English class, about fear, the power of fear. And this is what he says. He tells his class, "Fear, after all, is our real enemy. Fear is taking over the world. Fear is being used as a tool of manipulation in our societies. It's how politicians peddle policy and how Madison Avenue sells us things we don't need. Think about it. Fear we're going to be attacked. Fear that there are communists lurking around every corner. Fear that some little Caribbean country that doesn't believe in our particular way of life poses a threat to us. Fear that black culture may take over the world. Fear of Elvis Presley's hips. Well, maybe that one's a real fear. Fear that our bad breath might ruin our friendships. Fear of growing old and being alone." It's that fear that I want to talk about tonight, and particularly how fear is often used as a tool, fear as a product, fear as an industry. This is what I write about in my book, The Islamophobia Industry. I want to think about, to encourage us to think about Islamophobia, the fear of Muslims, anti-Muslim prejudice, not only as an organic social phenomenon, but as a product that is manufactured, packaged, sold, and consumed. When I wrote the book, if you remember, maybe you're familiar with what was happening in the United States at that time. This was the summer of 2010, and there was this hoopla over the Ground Zero mosque that wasn't a mosque and wasn't at Ground Zero. Maybe some of you remember that. I became quite fascinated with this whole event and began to sort of examine some of the key players, some of the key agitators, and it became increasingly clear to me that there were lines of connection between them, that there were shared resources, that there was shared funding, that many organizations and individuals that were involved often overlapped with one another. And that led me to write this book. I wanted to know really how we got at a place where we were talking about such a thing as the Ground Zero Mosque to begin with, and why that controversy seemed to resonate in the way that it did and pop up elsewhere across the United States in all sorts of other mosque oppositions. I wanted to know how we arrived at a place where 60% of Americans expressed that they have an unfavorable view of their Muslim neighbors, where a full half of Canadians today say the same thing, where 7 states in the United States have passed legislation banning non-existent Sharia law. I don't know how you ban something that doesn't exist, but they've managed to do it there. I'm telling you, it's absurd. 23 other states are debating the same thing. I wanted to know how we arrived at a place where 1 in 5 Americans still believe that Barack Obama is a Muslim. He's been our president for nearly 6 years. I wanted to know how we got to a place where we're talking about things like stealth jihad, creeping Sharia. That's right, I heard somebody say it. Who said it? There you are. All right. The creeping Islamization of wonderful cities like Toronto, Islamofascism, terror babies. Right? Have you guys heard about terror babies? Google it. It's not worth going over. No, but really, it turns out that you can slap fascism, the word fascism or terror, onto any word, and it suddenly becomes really frightening. No, seriously, I tried it the other night. I came home from work and I asked my wife if she had seen the bottoms to my terror jamas. And she, And Cheerio fascism, that's another one. That's Muslims taking over the world one tiny, delicious ring of honey-coated wheat cereal at a time. Yeah, kind of makes the Australian lads who say Cheerio mate seem rather suspicious, huh? No, but seriously, how did we get here? Some say, well, more Muslims are committing acts of terrorism and violence. Duh, it's easy. Increased anti-Muslim sentiment is simply a reflection of that. It's natural. But it turns out that's not the case at all. It is not the case that the uptick in anti-Muslim sentiment is a response to an increased number of terrorist attacks. Why? Well, the National Global Counterterrorism Center, the Global Terrorism Database, and the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security have all shown that terrorism is now at an all-time low. These are organizations that track terrorist attacks every year. They track the identity of the perpetrators. What was the worst decade for terrorism in the United States? Any guesses? No? The 1970s. Yeah. When I was just a pretty little twinkle in my mother's eye, and the rest of the country was running around worrying about the supposed communist takeover. What I argue in my book, which, by the way, is available after the event tonight, is that the decade-long spasm of anti-Muslim prejudice that we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, is not only an organic phenomenon, but that it's a product. It's the product of a tight-knit, interconnected, well-funded group of individuals who have labored for the past several years through their blogs, sermons, speeches, media interviews, books, CDs, DVDs, movies, podcasts, emails, town halls, lectures, lessons, legislation, tweets, op-eds, advertisements, websites, hearings, policy briefings, etc., to convince their compatriots that Muslims are gaining a dangerous influence in the West. So, in the time that I have remaining, I want to introduce you to several of the key players in the Islamophobia industry. Naturally, I'm not able to do all of that, and if I did, you wouldn't have any need to read my book. But I want to talk to you about who these individuals are, show you a little bit about where they get their funding, what their influences are, and how they have managed to turn Muslim bashing into full-time careers. Anyone here from Edmonton or Alberta? I'm not familiar with Canada's geography, so that could be like 500 miles away. I'm not. We have someone here, Edmonton. Any others? Oh, well then. right. Well, if he took the bus, it turns out that, yeah, it's interesting you say that. I was going to ask if anyone had seen the new bus ads in Edmonton or Alberta. Maybe you have. There are new bus ads in Edmonton and Alberta that just started running this week. They ask, is your family threatening you? Is there a fatwa on your head? The bus ads show 7 young Muslim girls who were all, sadly, victims of honor killings. A real but rare practice that I think we can all agree is nothing short of deplorable. Identical ads began running on buses in Tampa, Florida, earlier this week as well. What's the connection? The ads are the product of a group called the American Freedom Defense Initiative, AFDI. This is a group run by 2 individuals, Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer. For those of you who don't know, Pamela Geller is a 55-year-old woman from New York, a blogger, a provocateur, the internet's equivalent of a shock jock. She has said, for instance, that Obama is the bastard Muslim love child of Malcolm X. I know. That the liberal Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan is a fan of Hitler. That some Muslims have sex with goats, and that Serbian concentration camps in the 1990s didn't exist. I know. I had the same reaction when I heard that. Robert Spencer is a New Hampshire-based Catholic deacon, a former homeschool teacher whose diverse books include How to Teach Your Children to Enjoy Classical Music in Just 52 Easy Lessons, Classical Education in a Contemporary World, and Stealth Jihad. How Radical Islam is Subverting America Without Guns or Bombs. Yeah, he went from Beethoven to jihad. In full disclosure, I did my undergraduate degree in classical piano performance. So, Robert Spencer, just for the record, has referred to me as a dime store thug, a 2-bit gunzel, an Islamo-fascist supporter, a bottom feeder, and a Nazi enabler. I was pretty flattered until he called me a Nazi enabler. That one hurt my feelings. Actually, there's a story about Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer once claimed that he had found the evidence for the Muslim takeover of America. What was it? Campbell's Soup. Yeah. Campbell's Soup had offered a halal brand of their delicious chunky tomato bisques to go in line with, kosher brands that were offered by the company, and that to him was proof that Muslims were taking over the world. So we have, Cheerios, we have now Campbell's Soup. Fortunately, neither of those 2 food items were served tonight. That would have really freaked him out. But back to the ads. These bus ads in Canada are part of a larger campaign that has taken place in the past year in places like New York, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Chicago, several other major metropolitan cities that say things like Muslims are savages, support Israel, defeat jihad. They contain quotes from Osama bin Laden alongside, cherry-picked verses from the from the Quran, frightening images of the World Trade Center, all of your sort of stereotypical nonsense. On average, these ads cost around $8,000 a pop, although according to a recent report in the newspaper, The Jewish Voice, these ads, a recent batch of these ads cost as much as $70,000. They're funded, in part, from donations that readers to Spencer's blog, Jihad Watch, and Pamela Geller's blog, Atlas Shrugs, donate through PayPal accounts. And by the way, these are very popular blogs. For those of you that have a smartphone, I don't want to encourage you to use it while I'm talking, but you might Google jihad and see that the third site that comes up is Robert Spencer's Jihad Watch. You know what the first two are? Wikipedia and Merriam-Webster's dictionary. Just to give you an idea about sort of the traffic. The remainder of the funding from these ads comes from financial backers to Spencer, who, in addition to paying his salary as a full-time blogger, appropriate funds for all sorts of campaigns that AFDI runs. Some of those funds are also used for Spencer and Geller's other anti-Muslim group, Stop the Islamization of America. Funds have also been used for the third group that they run, Stop the Islamization of Nations. I'm not sure what they're going to do after nations, maybe world or something, but you know, they at any rate. These two individuals were the individuals that were behind the Park 51 protests that I mentioned a minute ago. So where does this money come from, right? I mean, aside from people that just log onto their websites and donate it, where does the big money come from, the thrust of the money? Well, it turns out that the David Horowitz Freedom Center, run by a man named David Horowitz, funds Robert Spencer. David Horowitz once ran a campaign called Islamofascism Awareness Week, which brought speakers who were critical of Islam and Muslims to more than 100 college campuses in the United States. David Horowitz has accused the Muslim Student Association of supporting a second Holocaust against Jews, and said in September of 2010 at the University of Massachusetts during a question and answer session that Palestinians are Nazis. He also happens to be the editor of Front Page magazine, which is I would say a prominent neoconservative online outfit that publishes the various articles written by people like Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller and others as well, others who happen to be less extreme in their views. But this is the man who bankrolls Robert Spencer to the tune of $180,000 a year. This is his base salary. He gets paid to blog. In 2011, I-990 forms show that Horowitz paid Spencer a separate grant of $95,000. And the most recent tax forms indicate that Spencer's Jihad Watch blog received more than $238,000 in revenue, a portion of which was siphoned off to AFDI, presumably to help cover the costs of these bus ads and other projects. I have requested the I-990 forms for 2012, but haven't received them yet. I keep getting sort of this pushback. Well, we requested an extension with the IRS, and sometimes, my phone calls aren't answered or my emails aren't answered, but I suspect that the money has only increased. Between 2010 and 2011, Spencer received a 17% raise. I have no reason to believe that the money has gone down since then. Horowitz himself is paid a salary of $490,000. So where else does the money trail lead? Where does Horowitz, who pays Spencer, get his money? Well, from several organizations and individuals. Between 2004 and 2009, the Fairbrook Foundation run by a little-known software engineer in California, worth $750 million, Aubrey Chernick. Chernick is a former trustee for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, WINEP, which serves as a think tank for AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and along with his wife, helps fund the Anti-Defamation League and CAMERA, which is a right-wing pro-Israel media watchdog outfit to violent Israeli settlers living on Palestinian lands. Also, Chernick funds the Zionist Organization of America, the Middle East Research Institute, a group that distributes translations of inflammatory Arabic language material, the Investigative Project on Terrorism, a group that tracks what it depicts as the threat of radical Islam, and the American Jewish Congress. Over a period of 5 years, he contributed nearly $254,000 to Robert Spencer's Jihad Watch directly, $620,000 to David Horowitz's Freedom Center, which, as I mentioned, funds Spencer. Another organization, the Becker Foundation, contributed more than $86,000 to Horowitz between 2001 and 2009. In addition, the Bradley Foundation, an established supporter of conservative causes, $4.3 million to Horowitz, and the Scaife Foundation, which is, they call Richard Scaife, who runs the foundation, the funding father of the right. He donated $3.5 million. So with that money, Geller and Spencer have been able to run these bus and metro ads, host public rallies and demonstrations that feature speakers like the Dutch politician Geert Wilders, the former, as it turns out now, former leader of the English Defense League, Tommy Robinson, and travel around the country where they drum up fears of the Muslim Brotherhood, and which, as we were saying at dinner, can't even hold on to power in Egypt. So it's kind of amazing that people would think that they somehow could have a grasp on the halls of power in Washington. They also drum up fears of Sharia law, right? That's the other big fear. Creeping Sharia, stealth jihad, creeping Sharia. Spencer and Geller, as it turns out, are connected to a man named David Yerushalmi, a lawyer, an attorney in New York, 58-year-old attorney in New York, who runs an organization called the Society of Americans for National Existence. Now, the acronym for that, if you can envision this in your mind, is, strangely enough, SANE. I mean, you can't even make this stuff up, right? Yerushalmi, though, is the principal architect behind virtually all of the anti-Sharia legislation in the United States. He authored a blueprint, sort of cookie-cutter piece of legislation that has been used in 68 out of 72 bills proposed in state legislatures across the country. Initially, the legislation that he wrote, the cookie-cutter bill that he wrote, directly targeted Muslims. The language in it was very inflammatory. And when that didn't go over so well, and he began to receive pushback, legal pushback, he realized that he had to change the language. So now, I believe the legislation is called American Laws for American Courts, and it's supposed to be sort of neutral of any religious language or language that attacks one particular religion or another. But I think it's pretty clear, if you know a little bit about the guy and where he gets his money and the types of people whom he frequents, the target is very much the Muslim community. Yerushalmi is an interesting character. I see that I just have a few more minutes here, so I'm going to try to speed through this. And as it turns out, he said some pretty stupid stuff too. He has said that blacks are the most murderous of peoples, that it should be a felony to practice Islam, punishable of up to 20 years in prison, that there should be special criminal camps for undocumented immigrants, that liberal Jews destroy their host nations like fatal parasites, and that there is a reason that America's founding fathers didn't give blacks and women the right to vote. This is, yeah, turns out he's a stand-up guy, huh? Yerushalmi is the attorney for Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer. Those bus ads that I mentioned earlier, in every single case that Geller and Spencer have faced pushback in the cities that wanted to refuse to run those bus ads, guess who has represented them in court? David Yerushalmi. He does this through the American Freedom Law Center, a law firm that he founded that takes on mostly cases dealing with Islam or free speech issues. And he practices what he admittedly calls lawfare. He rakes in legal fees, upwards of $35,000 per case, by essentially forcing legislation on these issues and then ensuring through the court systems his own payoff through SLAPP laws, which are intended to censor, intimidate, silence critics by burdening them with the cost of legal defense until they abandon their criticism or their opposition. Yerushalmi also receives funding from many of the same individuals that I've listed earlier, in addition to a man named Curtis Katz, who provides the bulk of the money that he uses to run these operations. Yerushalmi claims to be an expert in Sharia law, sort of like Robert Spencer claims to be an expert in Islam, but when you press him for details, he says, well, he's studied with some Muslim jurists, some experts in Islamic jurisprudence, but he doesn't ever name them and refuses to give too many more details. In 2006, Yerushalmi came into contact with a man named Frank Gaffney of the DC-based conservative think tank Center for Security Policy. At that time, Yerushalmi was starting a project called Mapping Sharia, and he needed some funding. So Gaffney offered $400,000 of initial funding to Yerushalmi's venture, and together they devised a program that sent secret informants disguised as Muslims into close to 100 mosques in the United States. These guys were infiltrating mosques in the United States before the NYPD was doing it. After a year, they concluded that 80%, this was the stat that they came up with from their investigation, that 80% of mosques in the United States preach violence. Now, that number is a number that has been repeated over and over and over again without ever really asking, what are the details, or what were the details of the study? Who conducted it? How was it carried out? It's just the case that 80% of mosques in America, so it goes, preach violence. So that sort of started the relationship between Gaffney and Yerushalmi. Gaffney agreed to serve on the board of Yerushalmi's group. Yerushalmi eventually raked in more than $153,000 in consulting fees from Gaffney's Center for Security Policy. Yerushalmi himself continued to receive enormous consulting fees from Gaffney's group. You see how that works? In 2009, Frank Gaffney's group paid Yerushalmi $154,000 in consulting fees. In 2012, $110,000. And SANE, the Society of Americans for National Existence, which is not sane, reported $386,000 in revenue in 2006, $390,000 in revenue in 2008. They dropped a little bit, sadly, in 2009, only $310,000. Together, Yerushalmi and Gaffney published a report about their findings called Sharia, the Threat to America. And they've really worked closely in recent years to implement this legislation that Yerushalmi has written into dozens of states. As I mentioned, 7 states have passed anti-Sharia laws, 23 others in the United States are considering them. A little bit more about Gaffney before I stop, because he's an interesting character too. Maybe you heard the story about Hillary Clinton's Deputy Chief of Staff, Huma Abedin. Anybody hear that, right? Huma Abedin was supposedly connected to the Muslim Brotherhood and that was, evidence that the Muslim Brotherhood influenced the Secretary of State, probably influenced the White House. Michelle Bachmann was the politician that was running her mouth about that. I believe this was 2 summers ago, something like that. Well, the whole idea originated from a report that was written, or a document that was written, really, and 5 other senators came on board, that was a product of Frank Gaffney. He sort of nurtured that story into being. And, there was some bizarre map that had like all of these lines that would give you a seizure if you tried to read it, showing like the connections between these people. Gaffney is convinced that the Muslim Brotherhood is infiltrating America. And he relies on one sort of obscure statement from a member of the Brotherhood 22 years ago. Since that time, other members of the Brotherhood have debunked that, said that it's nonsense, and Nathan Brown is perhaps one of the leading scholars in the United States on the Muslim Brotherhood and on Egypt's politics, said, quote, "Nobody has ever produced any evidence that that document," referring to the document that Frank Gaffney cited, "was more than something produced by the daydream of one enthusiast," end quote. Gaffney has also said that the missile defense logo of the Obama administration is evidence that the Muslim Brotherhood is taking over. Apparently there was a change in the graphic design. The Obama administration wanted to make their missile defense logo more sleek, right? Because it kind of looked old and stale. So they redesigned this thing and it looked kind of cool. It had some stars. And, well, he saw the new logo and concluded that the Islamic crest somehow fit into the logo. I mean, no one could really see it. But he believed that it was there, and because he could see it, he concluded that that was further evidence that there was some sort of Islamic influence. The Bradley Foundation, the Scaife Foundation, the Becker Foundation. There's a great report written by the Center for American Progress. It's called Fear, Inc., and I would encourage you to check it out. It lists in detail a lot of these organizations and the money that they provide. All of these organizations and individuals fund Frank Gaffney. Gaffney, in addition to his salary from CSP, received consulting fees from various organizations and groups of $272,000 in 2004, $288,000 in 2008, and the most recent filings, which are available publicly, show that his salary is right at $300,000 a year. So there are more people involved, obviously, and this is just to sort of give you a taste of what's in my book, to show some of the initial connections with some of the heavy hitters, some of the people that are really out front spinning these conspiracy theories about Muslims. And I hope that, that for those of you that are interested, we'll have a chance to continue this conversation after tonight's panel. I'll be signing books in the lobby, and thank you for your time.